First of all, since there is no FDA-approved medication, we do have to do everything that we can within our power to try and feel better ourselves. And even if there were FDA-available medications, we would think that nutrition would be an important aspect of disease management. It really is in all neurological diseases, and I'm sure in all disease in general. However, for neurological illnesses, there are specific diets. And even though we can't say the diet has been researched very well in ME/CFS, it's been researched quite well in analogous or similar conditions. So we have a place to start.
So you guys, today I have a very special guest, but it is not going to be someone that's new to you. This is an individual that I had on our podcast in the past on Hope and Health. And after I interviewed her, I found myself thinking about the interview over and over again, and realizing that there were so many more questions that I wanted to ask her that could help all of you out there in the community. So I got the Jamie Seltzer to come back. She is the scientific director of MeAction. Jamie's going to talk to us all about what MeAction is, about ME CFS. I always do that backwards, guys. That's my dyslexia showing its head. But really, I want to spend some time with Jamie today talking about real life experiences with individuals dealing with chronic illness, and real life tips and tools that I can bring to you. She is a wealth of knowledge. Jamie, thank you so much for coming back and talking with us.
Thank you for having me, Haylie.
So before we jump, right in, Jamie, will you give me some defining terms, some definition of what is ME/CFS?
Sure thing. So ME/CFS is myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome. And if you were diagnosed a couple decades ago, you might have just heard it as CFS, but it's been ME/CFS in the US for quite some time now. And it is a neurological disorder that's often associated with infection. About 80% of people say that they had an infectious disease first and ME/CFS symptoms followed. It's chronic. It's really rare that somebody recover completely from ME/CFS, although people do improve. And it's characterized by a symptom called post-exertional malaise, which is a flare of symptoms and maybe the appearance of some new symptoms after physical or cognitive exertion. And this flare is disproportionate to the amount of activity. It can have been a very small activity. And the recovery time is also disproportionate to the intensity of the activity. And there are a handful of other symptoms that are required for you to get your diagnosis, including fatigue that sufficiently decreases your ability to carry out your everyday tasks for at least 6 months, and cognitive impairment, or orthostatic intolerance, which is when your symptoms flare when you go from lying down to sitting up or sitting up to standing.
Is that like POTS?
That's like POTS. POTS is a type of orthostatic intolerance, and it's one of the more common types that's associated with ME/CFS. And also you have sleep dysfunction. We typically say unrefreshing sleep, which means that a patient can go to bed and lie there all night and feel like they have slept and wake up and not have any relief from their fatigue or other symptoms. It does not feel like you slept at all. Other people, however, have inverted sleep rhythms where they're very alert at night and very sleepy and out of it during the day. So this is what we call an infection-associated chronic illness. There are a handful of other such illnesses. You mentioned POTS. Hypermobility disorders can be exacerbated or unmasked by infection too. Mast cell activation disorder can be. We have the PANS/PANDAS in the pediatric populations. And multiple sclerosis as well has recently been found to be heavily associated with Epstein-Barr viral infection, which is the virus that causes mono.
Hey guys, it's Haylie again. Right about now, you might have questions that pertain to you and only to you. Let's continue the conversation. Go to HayliePomroy.com/member and get a free 30-day trial of my membership community. You're going to love this place. Post your questions, ask your questions, grab some downloads, and let's get you the help you deserve. In this space, is it important, or do people always identify the viral piece? And can there also be an environmental toxic piece? Like, can it be episodic? Like, I similar to our guys that had Gulf War injury, or people that have mold exposure that go into dysautonomic regulation or autoimmune dysregulation. Can that be sometimes a trigger for ME/CFS as well?
Absolutely. So we say infection associated, but even in that case, the infection is not always a viral infection. You can have fungal infections or bacterial infections that also seem to kick the disease off. And when we say infection associated as well, we mean that the disease itself as a whole is associated with infection beforehand. It doesn't mean that that is the kickoff in every single case.
Got it.
So you can have people who have a kind of physical trauma, like a surgery or a car accident, and that kicks them off. Major hormonal shifts, like the kinds that exist during pregnancy or after giving birth, can kick off ME/CFS. So really, I often say any sufficient immunological shakeup can lead to the disease.
I love that description. And I was just in Europe. I was in Slovenia, actually, at the International Autoimmunity Congress. And it was crazy because their embracement of ME/CFS is so, I feel like 10 to 12 years ahead of ours, in the sense of getting people to support, looking at the immune system, right? So many individuals that come into our clinic don't even have a full immunology workup. And we're just like, what? I mean, it just kind of blows our mind, because that's one of the first things that we want to look at is, how is the immune system modulating the body's response? It's that the adaptive hormones, the adaptive cytokines, the adaptive, T cells, all of that stuff that goes on in the body. So many people don't get adequate workups with it. How were you diagnosed? Like, tell me how this, I'm assuming you're not involved in this organization, because it sounded like a great thing to do on a Tuesday.
No, I would say it's more along the lines of being my life's work.
Thank you.
So it is, I was bound and determined to help people with this disease before I had it, however, because it runs in my family. So we talked about ME/CFS being a neurological disease, and we talked about it being an infection-associated chronic illness. And it seems that we're learning, and this might be new information to a lot of listeners, that the vast majority of, if not quite possibly, we hesitate to say this in science, all neurological illness may follow this pattern. So you have this sort of genetic susceptibility that you're born with, and then some immunological shakeup is what triggers your chronic illness. So we've seen that even Alzheimer's is associated with infection.
And we're seeing so much, and it'll be interesting. We just had this conversation in clinicals today, with long COVID, right? We're seeing people we feel like we're probably getting a lot of the referrals for long COVID, because we've seen patients for so long with ME/CFS that have this neurological imbalance, this immune dysfunction, or this immune imbalance. I don't like the word dysfunction, but the immune system doesn't right itself, or is continuing to work very hard as if there's an acute active infection. There's a whole lot of different profiles that we see, but it's like we get long COVID and we go, okay, we need to look at this. We're already, 20 steps ahead, because we've been looking at patients for so long in the body of work. Do you feel like there's a lot of learning that happened with ME/CFS that can be carried over into that space?
Oh, absolutely. And, we've talked before about how a variety of different infections can trigger this disease state. And I would say that it's reasonable to say SARS-CoV-2 is one of them, which is not to say that everyone with a long COVID label has ME/CFS. There are other diseases and disorders that can arise. But I think it's quite fair to say that ME/CFS is one of them, and that when you look at the more syndromic chronic pictures, you're often looking at ME/CFS.
They sure seem to look a lot alike.
A lot alike. I've also said a number of times that symptoms come from different buckets, different sources, different origins. And so that's going to shift the way that these diseases present depending on the triggering pathogen. The first bucket is the damage done by the initial infection. And that does shift depending on which pathogen it is or was. And that has to be addressed. Bucket number 2 is, do you have viral fragments, or do you have lingering infection, or do you have something like EBV that can hide out in cells and reactivate later? And do you have the co-infections that you see in people who are mildly immunocompromised? And all of those have to be treated as infections. But then you'd also have the immune, metabolic, and endocrine shifts that you see as a result of the body adapting or dealing with that original hit. And that is what I would term ME/CFS. But that is why we see, this is all my conception, of course, but this is, to my way of thinking, the reason that we see a slight variety in presentation based off of what that original hit is, based off of the original natural biology of the person.
Right.
But you do still see distinct commonalities. And post-exertional malaise, that really aberrant, unusual response to exertion, is the thing that ties everything together that we consider to be ME/CFS.
And it's interesting because in our translational research, when we're doing, in like research with the patient, or we're trying to figure out appropriate models of therapy, and luckily nutrition and supplements is such a big model in our clinic, I think, because there's such a diversity in each person that's experiencing this diagnosis, right? There's diversity in the air they breathe, the house they live in, the stress they're exposed to, the shows they watch. There's such diversity. And in order to adapt to all of that diversity, everything's nutrient dependent, right? Everything we do is nutrient dependent. So one of the reasons why we try to kind of foundationally make sure that we look at those aspects is because, like you said, there's the damage, there's how the body responds to the damage, and how the body responds to a new body that's been responding to damage, right? We in clinicals today, and I was thinking about preparing kind of to meet with you today. We were talking in long COVID how suddenly clinically we're seeing all these people pop positive for PCR EBV again, and not IgM. I mean, not IgG, not even IgM, which sometimes we think, okay, that's active infection. But with PCR, it's either there or it's not, right? They're actually looking for the particles of the virus. And it's like, what, we were having a what the heck is going on meeting, right? And what we all came down to was, let's focus on, we're doing lots of research on what's going on from a viral perspective, but let's focus on how we can support the host. How can we support the patient that's going through this process, and not forget that this is a person that's experiencing this? Because so often, I feel like oftentimes in science and research, we think about, parts of, or we start to silo and talk about the body as if it's not a human being sometimes, right? We say, well, what's this enzyme doing in response to this particular virus, instead of what does this person feel like when they wake up in the morning? And so I love that we have the clinicals on that meet with our research on Fridays, because it brings it to the patient, right? And not flow cytometry or mouse models or whatever. It's like the patient.
I have to admit, I don't really see those things as separate.
They're not. They're absolutely not. And that's where we get in trouble, is sometimes they can get siloed when we're focusing or thinking on something. So no, I agree with you. They're not. I'm 100% with you. Yes.
Hey guys, it's Haylie, Pomroy, your host. Right about now, you're probably struggling to achieve the health that you deserve, and you're just not sure what you need to do in order to get it. So what I've done is I've created a special link for you that will give you the nutrition and supplement programs that I use in my private practice to achieve amazing results for my clients and my community. go to HayleePomroy.com/podcast. Plus, when you use that link, you'll get a 20% discount just because I love you. Again, that's HayleePomroy.com/podcast. Now, back to the episode.
I know you had a lot of, it was kind of like me in the autoimmune space. I had a lot of life and family experience. And then it was like, who, me? You know what I mean? I know this, but how did it happen for you?
So I had a background. I went to Rutgers for plant science. I went to a very tiny alternative medicine school for my MS in clinical alternative medicine. And I did those things because my mom had been very ill. She had an ME CFS diagnosis. Her trigger was EBV. At her worst, she's 5'5". She weighed 87 pounds. And her body just rejected everything. And she did not get as much dismissal as I think other people do because she looked so ill. She was presenting very ill, which for our listeners, a lot of people with ME/CFS look like they're just fine,
right?
At a glance.
Get some rest.
Yes. And, but she was also jaundiced as well as having lost that much weight. She was in liver failure. And I believe she saw 11 clinicians before getting her first working diagnosis and treatment. And part of that was the time. It was the very early 90s before, for those of us who are super familiar with the history, before the Fukuda criteria from the CDC even existed to diagnose the disease. So the time period meant that people kept telling her, now I want you to prepare yourself. We're going to test you for HIV. And it would come back negative, and they would pat her hand and say, now, dear, it's often negative for quite some time at first.
Yeah.
And that just on repeat. So when I began to get sick, I got sick not at the same time, but at the same age as she did. Which plays into the hormones' role in regulating immune function to some degree. And I didn't know what was wrong because this disease presents differently in different people, even people who are related. If you lined up all of my mother's symptoms side by side with all of mine, there would be a 99% overlap.
Wow.
But if you asked for the top 3 most concerning symptoms in the two of us, probably there would have been a 0% overlap.
Do you think that's because you were at a certain age and she was at a certain age, so that her priorities had progressed or were now expressing differently? You know what I mean? Like, because I see that with my daughter. So I was diagnosed with autoimmune at 20, in my early 20s, and my daughter found herself with an immune dysregulation in her 20s at the hospital. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I was trying to think of what I experience now versus what I experienced in my 20s. And that's why I was just wondering, like.
No, I mean, her primary issues were digestive, obviously, liver damage, and she could no longer tolerate a whole bunch of foods.
Okay.
So digestive and immunological, and mine were mostly neurological. I had terrible cognitive dysfunction. When we think about brain fog and cognitive impairment, you might have heard me say minor cognitive impairment, but that's because I'm comparing it to dementia and Alzheimer's when I say minor.
Wow.
So yeah, I was
major if you were comparing it to your peers.
Yes.
Got it.
I was leaving Post-it notes for myself around the house at age 29. I couldn't remember if I'd run the dishwasher or if I would put something I would put my phone in the fridge, things like that you think of as early signs of dementia, honestly. Word finding was trouble. I couldn't really complete a coherent thought. And then I began to have issues with peripheral neuropathies and things like that as well. So there were a lot of nervous system symptoms that were quite overt for me.
How did you get diagnosed? Like, did you have an in because your mom had docs and it was?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Nope. So what happened was I was already sick enough that I had to quit work. And And again, this is pre-diagnosis. I couldn't function. And I was doing what a sensible human person does when they have to quit work. I was forming a book club with my old work friends to stay social and planning on like once a week lunch outings with my closest friend at the time. And of course, I was trying to think about how to stay fit. So I bought a stationary exercise bike and I put it in my spare room. And I knew that there was something physical going on with my ability to be active. So I just started with 5 minutes. And that was okay. I felt fine. And then I went to 7 minutes and I felt a little strange, but it was fine. 10 minutes, I started to feel very odd. And again, I'm talking, this is over a week or two. So I'm going up very slowly, doing what I did not know is graded exercise therapy. I hit over 10 minutes, maybe 11 or 12 of biking. And I had an episode of PEM that it was a medical crisis. And this is part of the reason why I personally characterize PEM as a pathological state and not a symptom.
Tell me what PEM is.
Post-exertional malaise.
Yes.
So the thing we described at the beginning of the podcast, where you have this flare of symptoms, and something that is a really good indicator is if your body responses to exercise is the inverse of what it would be for a healthy person.
Got it.
So typically healthy people, they exercise, they get a little burst of endorphins and they feel good.
Yes.
And their brain function actually improves. Their cognitive function improves. Their heart beats faster and their circulation improves. So what happens to someone with ME? Their heart rate drops, their blood pressure drops, their core body temperature drops, their cognitive function drops. And having that all happen suddenly and intensely is something else.
Yeah.
So I was so cold that I was shaking my whole body and couldn't think clearly. And when I finally got off the bike, I tried to get in a hot shower, but my body wouldn't warm up. Fell into bed and we can call it slept or we can call it passed out, and woke up 18 hours later.
Wow.
And what did I do? I was a formerly able-bodied person. I waited 3 or 4 days and I tried again.
Oh.
The same thing happened, only to a lesser degree, because I recognized the signs of what was happening and stopped. So, when people think to themselves, ME CFS is just when you're tireder than normal, I'm like, oh, goodness. No. Not at all. And even for people who have a more minor presentation, mine was verging on moderate at that point. They'll go out, they'll have a day where they perhaps go to the mall or they go see a movie. And then the whole next day they kind of have to spend at home recovering.
Right.
And it's quite normal for people, listen up, everybody who thinks they might have this. It's quite normal for people who are minor presenting to get through a work week and spend the whole weekend basically unconscious.
Right.
And then get up and do it all again Monday and hope that they're never going to slide any further down. But that's not something you want to bank on. You do want to learn how best to take care of yourself when you have these kinds of issues. So that all happened. And then I looked up online, what happens if when you try to exert yourself, you basically die? And I found the diagnostic criteria for ME CFS. I found a patient forum for ME CFS. I said, who should I go to? Read a bunch of different things, visited the specialist states away. I had to fly in.
Wow.
And I remember because he was looking at my MRI, he was taking blood, he was doing digestive stuff. And, he's chattering to me about my disease presentation. And I go, but do I have it? And he goes, what? Yes, of course you do. Moving on.
Oh, geez.
He was very funny. A lot of people didn't necessarily like that kind of straightforward bedside manner, but I'm a straightforward person. And I thought it was great.
Yes. Now you know what, at least you know
what you're working with.
Yes, you know what you're working with. And so at that point, had you already had your degree in plant sciences? And
Yeah, I had all of my degrees. The ones that I have now, BS and MS, and had my clinical training. I'm to say clinical. I'm not a doctor. It was an MS to be
yes,
100% clear for all of our
yes.
listeners. But I had training in compounding. I did see clients for alternative medicine and nutrition. We had a clinic attached to the school. So that in many ways that saved my life.
So can we talk about that for a minute? Because it's when we got off our last podcast, and I was like, I mean, first of all, I have a degree in agriculture and soil sciences, so I was like, my friend. I just felt like such a kindred spirit. Then you went into the alternative medicine, which is what I did, for years and years and years, was create alternative medicine clinics and nutrition and herbs and homeopathy and all of that. And so I did not set out in the world to do it. I was well on my way to vet school, right? This was not my plan. It became what I didn't know was my life's work, right? And mission. But it saved my life. There is no doubt. There is nobody that could ever, or anything that could ever convince me that the incorporation of nutrition and natural therapies in general saved my life, period. That's what I fully believe. I was able to, not take the medications by my choice, right? That I was also had been prescribed for my autoimmune disorder through strengthening my body. I haven't been on steroids since my 20s, which is amazing because I was on between 60 and 80 milligrams of prednisone every day.
Oh,
and
boy.
yeah, oscillated between Imurin and Celcept, which are anti-rejection drugs, and Mepron, which when your immune system can't modulate, mine's different. It's autoimmune. Although I have a question for you about that. When I was overseas, but I was on Mepron because I had so many co-infections all the time, right? Because my immune system would be like, oh, Babesia, or something whatever normal things that maybe people get exposed to, my body would just, I was the hostess with the mostest for lack. So I got to take, anti-malaria medication like it was candy. So I am not only indoctrinated, and I believe so heavily in the power of nutrition and in nourishing the body and working with the body. But I want to hear about kind of your experience with that and why that was, to read about something is one thing, to formally educate is another, and to practice is even more, right?
And to experience is another, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll start by saying that I think that there is a minor anti-supplement, anti-nutrition bias in the disease, in people with the disease, and it's really natural and understandable. Folks with ME/CFS have had to deal with an environment where there are no FDA-approved medications for this drug in the United States, and there's nothing approved in Canada. So they've had to make their own way. And a lot of them would really like the privilege of having the option to take a prescription medication for their disease. So they feel like they're being fobbed off. However, I would say that, first of all, since there is no FDA-approved medication, we do have to do everything that we can within our power to try and feel better ourselves. And even if there were FDA available medications, we would think that nutrition would be an important aspect of disease management. It really is in all neurological diseases, and I'm sure in all disease in general. However, for neurological illnesses, there are specific diets. And even though we can't say that diet has been researched very well in ME/CFS, it's been researched quite well in analogous or similar conditions. So we have a place to start.
That's good. Yeah. And I think one thing, I had somebody that was in our community, and they were talking about, my doctor said all I needed to know was, I don't know, it was like, don't eat citruses. They picked a food group, whatever it was. Right. And I said, did they also say don't eat Diet Coke and Kentucky Fried Chicken and Burger King and, all the anti-foods that are going to actually strip your body? Or were they just focusing on some don't do carbs today food group? You know what I mean? Like, we want to nourish the body. It's for me, it's so much more not about what not to do, but about what to do, right? In a body that's struggling. And we say, like, it was interesting. I had a neurologist explain to me, oftentimes in neurology, we think of almost like micro nerves, right? And we think of major, like our spinal column. But what we sometimes don't talk about is the adaptive neurotransmitters, and especially in our innate. That's why neuroimmunology goes together in our innate or our immune response in the body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our immune response is meant to defend us and, make us sweat so we can regulate our electrolytes, our heartbeat, all of those things in that adaptive piece. And everything we do from an adaptive perspective is nutrient dependent, right? Whether we don't have adrenal corticotrophic hormones just hanging around, we actually have to manufacture those out of nutrients. And so
well, we have to manufacture everything out of nutrients, except like the very basic, except for oxygen.
But oxygen, the exchange of oxygen through the heme molecule is a nutrient.
Sure.
Yeah, that's right.
But we are breathing that one in. That's something that we get not from eating, but pretty much everything else. We're getting all of our raw materials from what we're putting into our bodies.
Right.
I used to teach, and I just find that the very basic, like chemistry and physics of it, is sometimes missed even by people who are highly educated. They're not thinking about where are our building blocks to ensure we have enough of chemical X, Y, or Z in our bodies. Where's that coming from?
Right. And no, I absolutely agree. And then we hope sometimes if they get the macros, if they know talk about, we just had a clinical today, are they getting enough grams of protein? And I'm like, what form, what source? And don't forget all of the cofactors and the enzyme secretions that have to happen in order to be able to take that big old chunk of protein into amino acids. Like, it is such a nutrient. I mean, it's shocking when you start to just look at one. We were looking at cofactors the other day, and all of the nutrients that happen in one immune modulating cofactor, right? And what vitamins are put in, or what cofactors are put in, or how ATP to ADP is cleaved. Like, all of that is nutrient dependent. And I just wish we could say that everybody has to do nutrition in their practices. Then I think if everybody did nutrition and focused on sleep, we'd be in a much, much better place. But why in this particular, and I want to talk about tips and tricks too, because when I've had clients or friends or family members that have ME CFS, the biggest thing that I try to not do, and I tell my coaches this when I'm training them, is do not give them a to-do list, right? Try to help them identify what would be the most powerful support. And some of that, and so we have, like, in their coaching sessions, I go, don't say, now I want you to, and I do believe, I love compression stockings, on the waist, elevate the feet, heart rate monitoring, pacing yourself, but make sure that you help these people articulate, help this community, help us articulate, how can I ask for help that's going to make a significant impact or take some burden off? Are there things that you think just kind of fundamentally can be uniformly helpful to a body that's in this kind of space?
No. And there's a reason why I'm so definitive with that.
I love it.
There's more than one stage of ME/CFS, and there's more than one body.
Oh,
so yes. Right. So those two things have to both be taken into account. The first is that, and I know that I'm generalizing when I say this. I have some peer-reviewed support to say this, and I have a lot of lived experience to support this, but I'm not as sure of this as I would like to be. So I'm prefacing what I'm about to say with all of that. There appears to be a state of elevated inflammation and immune hyperactivation early in the disease. And that's one of the things that worries me about the way that people are characterizing long COVID, because we're mostly looking at the first couple of years. Right. So we're seeing this hyperinflammatory picture. All the recommendations for long COVID are based off of that hyperinflammatory picture as of yet. And then, of course, the body can't maintain that indefinitely. You slide towards a more immune exhaustion picture. If you're lucky, you might have some states, some aspects of your immune function that do stay high, even as others begin to die off, drop low. A very common immunological picture is elevated IgE with lower than usual IgA. And that is uncomfortable because it causes immune hyperreactivity in folks and a more of an MCAS picture, but it is an adaptive, like it can be worse.
So
That's one of the better outcomes.
It's a survival mechanism.
Yes, absolutely.
And do you see a lot of the food allergy component coming up?
Sure.
Or
you see that early on, particular in the disease. It's very common to have new allergies and intolerances that you did not have before, or that, perhaps you had some reactivity to them when you were basically healthy, but it was negligible in the past.
And also sometimes the chemical sensitivities.
Yes, chemical sensitivities and also sensory sensitivities. I don't know that those should really go hand in hand beyond conceptually. Like, I don't think the pathology is necessarily similar, but it may very well be. So you see all of those kick up early on in that hyperexcitatory phase. You might have the patient who runs a low-grade fever as well. And there's more of a likelihood for neuropsych symptoms that early too, because a brain on fire is a brain on fire.
Right.
Then over that immune exhaustion phase, you get to looking more like an immunocompromised patient.
I was going to say that's the repeated HIV testing.
Right. That's you must just have HIV. Although it's also quite common, by the way, for a body fighting a virus to become more susceptible to fungal infection. Again, this is one of my general hypotheses. There's some peer-reviewed evidence to support what I'm saying, but it's not broadly accepted. So even during that hyperinflammatory phase where your body is trying to kick the butt of the virus, you can get these fungal infections because the shifts that your body makes in order to combat a viral infection leave you open to fungal infection.
Right.
But just to clarify before we scoot forward. But after that, like first 2 years or so of illness, your immune function in general begins to go down. And it's just a very different disease picture. And it is associated with different metabolic pictures, which means you may need quite a different diet in early ME versus the chronic phase.
Absolutely. We love to look at what the chemistry is doing as much as possible, but also what the human being is experiencing, right, is so important for us to understand. Like you had mentioned, the sleep cycles, bloating after eating, how they're experiencing food, any rashing, those types of things. When we were in Europe a couple of weeks ago, one thing that struck me, and we all walked out of it going, well, that was interesting, is they're putting this in the umbrella of autoimmune conditions. Interesting, right? We all, day one, we said, are you noticing, and it was the International Autoimmune Congress, but they talk about that the patient should be screened additionally for autoimmune markers and making sure that in either the early stages of excitation or in the exhaustion stage that the body doesn't start to create autoantibodies, whether it's in a confused, like with MS, right? Or in a confused state, or if it's a disease overlap. Like, it was just a really interesting conversation. But I will tell you, every immunologist, virologist, everybody that was there over and over and over again said, if you don't address the nutrition of the patient, you are completely leaving out the opportunity for the patient to feel better. Like, it's because, and they do use a lot of the biologics over there. We use that. Immunovir, Cytogam. There's a little more, I would say liberally, a little more freely with their ME patients than we would use if we have a CMV positive patient, maybe. But even with the EBV positive, some of the Immunovir that has high EBV titers, but those aren't without those. I wish there was a magic bullet. None of it's a magic bullet. Because there's a
sadly no. And I do think that for early patients, who might be listening and thinking, maybe I have this, or my friend has this, or my spouse has this, my child, it's very tempting to say, well, what one thing do I just do and get rid of this?
Right.
This is a chronic illness. Think of it in the same context as diabetes. You're going to try a bunch of things out. You're going to need to change your lifestyle and your diet, and you're going to manage it from now on. And there is a really good chance that you will feel better if you manage well. However, there's no way to snap your fingers and be better. And also, it's unlikely it's going away. It's unlikely you're going to wake up and be better. If you've been sick for over a year or two, it's unlikely. And I have a lot of clinicians who chide me for acknowledging that. But the reality is that the rest of the human population who are not doctors are not children. And they need to have a realistic picture of how things are going and have as much information as they can have in order to make the right decisions about their health.
So my goal is always to try to change the environment internally, externally, so that people don't end up in the hospital, right? End up in a hospital bed, I mean, I'd like to make their world more conducive to feeling better. So we do focus on cleaning up the home, right? Making sure that they don't have additional environmental toxic burdens. Obviously pacing is big. We talk about, we're typically go with, some people call it like food rotation. And in the food allergies world, it became called food rotation. We try to make low impact food rotation types of nutrition plans so that a person isn't eating, broccoli and boiled chicken every day, right? Because the diversity of gut bugs and digestive enzymes can help the body both in inflammation and exhaustion. Like, our goals are to do that. What are some of the things that you do in your daily, I would love some of your history of what you've done, but just what you do daily to manage things from a lifestyle perspective?
Well, so historically, people are probably not going to think that this is super fun, but I did pure keto at the very outset because my inflammation was through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
This is the kind of thing that's recommended for other neurological illnesses like epilepsy. And so I have to say, keto as a medical diet often doesn't really focus where your food is coming from. They're just telling you a certain number of carbs versus a certain number of fats. I did not find that to be the case. I've never done super well with animal fats. I can eat meat, but it was not helpful. I primarily needed to be eating saturated plant fats, plain protein, plain vegetables, and as low carb as humanly possible. And when I say that, I think most people misunderstand what I mean. No bread, no French fries, no root vegetables, no fruit, no pure keto. True ketos is quite a different thing from the paleo that most people are used to.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
How long did you do that for?
It was actually quite some time. I would say it was the whole acute phase. So like a year, 2 years, something along those lines.
Okay.
And I could tell it was right for me because I felt so much better.
Okay.
The pain was pretty bad when I was first sick, especially this is kind of an ME classic symptom that you have pain where the skull meets the spine. And when I was being diagnosed, my clinician took his pointer finger and middle finger and pushed in that area, and I levitated off the table. I screamed. So it's very common to have pain there if you have ME. And one of my strangest, it's pseudo-encephalitic kind of pain.
Right.
I remember waking up with my head like geared off of the pillow and I was fully unconscious, but I was holding it off the pillow to try to prevent the pain. 24 hours after totally abandoning sugar and carbohydrates. It was the first time I woke up without pain since I'd gotten sick.
Wow. And what types of things do you do now, today?
So now I generally speaking do much more of a paleo approach. Um, a change of environment was very good for me. I was in a very hot, very wet area. I moved to the San Francisco Bay where it is warm, but there is no water. It's like 17 inches of rain a year. And that really improved my well-being enough that I could reincorporate some carbohydrates into my diet again.
And was that an intentional move, or did you get there and go, oh, this is interesting?
I got there and said, oh, this is interesting. However, it was not the first time I'd noticed environment really makes a difference. And I'll say for folks who are interested in the fungal aspect, I think that that's a viable conclusion. And I would add that if you have a neurological disease, you should know that air pressure shifts dramatically before storms. It makes a really big difference in disease presentation and things like migraine as well. So I would say like it's not or it's probably a yes and kind of deal. But you should definitely be aware that if you live in a place where it storms often, if you have the means, you might consider relocating. You might consider staying with a friend for a week or two to see elsewhere to see how it does for you.
Right.
I know people with ME who have moved out to the desert.
Right.
Because and I mean stripped out in a stripped out van with nothing from the previous environment. People go to extremes because their suffering is so immense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you incorporate any herbs or supplements or
Another unpopular opinion. So the
no,
issue
it's not unpopular.
No, I'm about to say something that you may or may not agree with. So people with ME have allergies and intolerances and sensitivities like we've talked about.
Yeah.
A lot of the herbs that I would have thought to give to someone like me are an absolute no. In particular, anything that messes with the endocrine system or neurotransmitters is just it's too much for someone like me, and I really would dissuade people from doing it in the same way that I dissuade people from using glucocorticoids in these diseases for very similar reasons.
Right.
People think that because plants are natural, they will de facto be safer, but a chemical is a chemical. And so, you have a glucocorticoid-like compound in licorice, or you have an actual glucocorticoid, like the chemical dissimilarities are very small, and that's the point.
Right.
So, you're going to provoke a similar response. So the only herb that I still use is Vitex agnus castus, and that's chaste tree. And the reason that I use it is that this is actually interesting stuff.
So wait, say that again. What's the herb that you use?
Vitex agnus castus.
Is that a brand or is that
That's the Latin name.
Okay, perfect.
And I would urge people too that if they're considering trying an herb, be very careful of the word standardized.
Yes.
Because that means they've taken a chemical and they've added it to the dry herb in an attempt to have the same level of this chemical in every dose. That defeats the purpose of using an herb. Part of that natural variability means that your body is less likely to get used to and find a way to work around that intervention. So and also it's going to increase the dose dramatically from what you would get from taking the herb. So just plain Vitex. And the reason that I do this is because I had terrible breathing issues. And again, I'm not triggered by COVID. I've been sick for quite some time. As far as I know, I was not triggered by a respiratory infection of any sort. Air hunger is the symptom I experience. There's no obstruction. My body isn't getting enough oxygen, or my oxygen dependent reactions at the cellular level are maybe accelerated. It's hard to say.
Which is, I go back to your first indicator, right? With your post-exertional malaise, right? You were oxygen depleted once you got, I wonder what your VO2 max was at that point, right? I that would have been for me.
I've had a cardiopulmonary exercise test. Let's just say it did not go well, and they administered supplemental oxygen, and strongly asked me multiple times, would you like some oxygen? Because they had to get my permission before I passed out, apparently.
Yeah.
So this is something that a lot of people with long COVID experience. and they think I had a respiratory infection. It makes sense I can't breathe. And there certainly is lung fibrosis in some folks. But
Right, but we have people with totally normal PFTs. I mean, I'm just saying,
Yes.
and the PFT's normal, the CT scan's normal, and they're starving for oxygen. And it's on a cellular mitochondrial or on a cellular level for sure.
Yes. So it's also a circulatory and an autonomic kind of problem.
Yes.
So Vitex agnus castus is, I found out that increasing progesterone, which Vitex does indirectly by modulating FSH-LH balance, has been used when people can't tolerate cortisol-based inhalers for asthma.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was having a breathing episode, and I brewed up a disgusting decoction of Vitex and chugged it, and it was the first time my breathing problems settled in ever in the middle of an episode.
So I was just thinking, people out there that are listening, if they've recently been diagnosed, and this came through from our community. We had a doc so one of our docs said that they love Dr. Google personally, because they feel like people come in, they are vested in themselves, they research it, they've got, focused questions. And we've had docs that we've worked with in the past that say, the patient, went and saw Dr. Google before me. And I said, oh my goodness, we really want a patient that is vested in and informed. Where do people go? Can you give me like your organization? How can they connect with you?
Well, so we are at www.meaction.net, and you can find us there. We've got a tool that will allow people to find clinicians.
Yes.
We've got our resources, including the pacing guide, which will teach you the activity management strategy that is most effective in this disease. And we also have one you can give to your doctor called the Clinician's Pacing Guide that's fully cited and referenced. We do not really have a list of recommended treatments ourselves, but I was the co-author of Mayo Clinic Proceedings' recent concise clinical review on ME/CFS. And that's something you can print out and hand to your doctor too if they're unfamiliar with the disease. And it has some treatment recommendations in it. And clinicians can also subscribe to Ask Mayo Expert, which has the diagnostic and treatment algorithm that I co-authored with Mayo Clinic staff.
That's wonderful. That's great. Let's jump into the nutrition aspect of it. So, everything's nutrient dependent, right? So what we put into our bodies and on our bodies are going to have a significant impact, and probably the most powerful impact, right, on our bodies, except for maybe what we have in our mind, because they all work together, believe it or not. How important do you think it is to people to address those types of things?
I think it's very important. I think that it can be challenging to have good nutrition when you have this disease. I recommend actually that people get their normal allergy testing, but I do recommend IgG intolerance testing. I know it's not as well validated, but personally, from my own perspective, I found it very helpful. I was very skeptical. I said, well, perhaps I'll eliminate the top 2 or 3 things that they tell me I'm reacting to. And I did, and I felt so much better. And I said, well, maybe the next 2. And I did, and I felt so much better. And now I pretty much, I avoid 6 or 7 foods. The ones at the very bottom, I just try to do less frequently. And when I say very bottom, I mean the things I react to, but very little.
Yeah.
So that was a big deal.
I love the IgG intolerance testing. I mean, I just think we're trying to take as many burdens off the body as we possibly can. And
Exactly.
Right. And the body, no matter what you ingest, the body will do its darndest to reduce it to something that can be dealt with or used it's either going to be used as a support mechanism in the body, or it's going to stress the body so the body can get rid of it or store it somewhere. Right. And so if we can not select foods that we know that evoke a stress response in our immunoglobulins, that's what IgG stands for. So in our immune system, right, then that can impact. The other thing that we were talking about before we started was tips. Like I love to tell people, go through our cookbooks, find crock-pot based or Instapot based recipes that sound really good, right? That sound good, that sound nourishing, and either print those out, put them on a little card. And when your friends or family members say, hey, how can I help you this week? Like, let other people prepare for you if possible. Stock your freezer full of foods you've prepared instead of packaged foods, right? Because saying, I want you to sit and cook all day, Saturday, Sunday, to your point, sometimes those are the only days that people can crawl in bed and stay in bed if they're trying their hardest to be, I'm going to use
well, so I present moderately, I would say, although I show up as minor, but that's because of what I do to try to help myself. And I do it a little differently. I will prepare one ingredient because, standing in the kitchen for an hour, that's beyond a lot of people with ME/CFS, but being in the kitchen for 15 minutes, that's doable for a lot of people. So perhaps you peel your carrots and you chop them to the right size, and then you put them in a bowl and you put them in the fridge and you're done for now.
Right.
And you do that enough. And then when it is Saturday and you think, I maybe have an hour of activity, that's when you reach into your fridge and you pull things out. Now, a lot of people will say, I can't really think that far ahead. You'd be surprised. You're waiting for your morning cup of coffee. You're going to be standing there. You might as well also be chopping a carrot.
Right.
So the other thing that I do is that I will prepare intermediate step items. So like if I have carrots and I have onions and I have celery, I will make, I'm sure I would butcher the pronunciation, but it's basically a traditional French simmered vegetables kind of base. And you can use it for soups. You can take a spoon of it and put it in your omelet in the morning. And so I'll make a bunch of it at once and I'll add it to a whole bunch of different things. And it's basically just oil of your choice. I'll usually use olive oil or coconut oil and equal amounts of onion, carrot, and celery, or whatever other vegetables you happen to have. And if you have somebody like me, like everybody with ME who has digestive problems, chop it way finer than you think.
We say puree too.
Yeah, I think when you get to puree, if you have any issues with sugar, that might release the sugar a little too fast.
Valid.
But if you have a chopper and you can like chop it, into slices and then put it in your grinder and give it, 30 seconds so that the pieces are just a couple centimeters, then I think it also reduces your cooking time. You're not going to be standing in front of the stove for a billion hours. It's going to be done faster than you can possibly imagine. And I'm if you want to look it up, I'm thinking of Mirepoix or Mirepoix. I'm forgetting exactly how you say it. We might have to cut that out. Yeah. But I do that kind of thing all the time. If I do have the energy to be doing food prep and I chop an onion, I'll chop an extra one and drop it in the freezer.
That's great.
Yeah. And I rarely use pre-prepared things just because they tend to have a lot of ingredients and there's a high chance that there's something that my system is not going to like.
Absolutely. And there's a reason why they stay either shelf stable or even, they stay stable.
True. But a lot of that's vitamin E. That's tocopherol. You can eat that vitamin E.
We hope that's what it is. So Jamie, just like last time, I feel like I'm left with a ton more questions. I don't ever want to take advantage of your wealth of knowledge, background, life experience, empathy that you have. And shines through in all of your life's work. But please come back on. Our community really enjoyed our last podcast. I know this podcast is going to be a favorite, but I want to dive into supplements and natural therapies and even more food details with individuals dealing with just in general, chronic inflammatory, neuroinflammatory, ME, CFS as well.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Haylie.
Love to have you back. We'll talk soon. Thank you so much, Jamie.
Thank you. Bye.